Hello, everyone. My name is Tobi Fagbule, and I'm a fellow student at the GSD in the MDes program. Today's panel is titled Designing for Black Queer Pleasure, Joy, and Intimacy. We have seen a tremendous expansion of spaces in which the interior lives of Black people are affirmed and celebrated, from social media to art collectives like Pappy Juice. At the same time, anti-Black racism and violence reinforce the boundaries of everyday Black existence in physical and digital spaces. In, in Covenant architects, pleasure activists, and cultural scholars, this panel aims to encourage architects, planners, and designers to design spaces that accommodate both the security and exuberance of Black and queer bodies. Today's moderator today will be Malcom Rio. Rio is a graphic and architectural designer and thinker based in Providence, Rhode Island, where they work as an assistant professor of architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design. Rio is also currently doing a PhD student in the architectural history and theory at Columbia University, where they research on topics of sexuality, race, kinship, citizenship, urbanism, imperialism, and colonialism across the long 19th and 20th centuries. Rio holds a Master of Science in Architecture Studies from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where they were recognized in the 2019 SM Arc Thesis Prize and the Author Roach Special Prize for Research on Urbanism House Ballroom Culture in New York City, titled Drag Hinge, Reading the Skills Between Architecture and Urbanism 2019. Additionally, Rio has earned a Master of Architecture from Rhode Island School of Design and both a Bachelor of Science in Philosophy and the Bachelor of Fine Arts in Arts, plus Design from Towson University. Rio's scholarship, criticism, and interviews have appeared in Threshold's Averyville, the New York Review of Architecture, NPS, and Pigeon, as well as forthcoming books like The Living Room, volume on sexuality, gender, and architecture, edited by Sophie Hutcherson. Now I'm going to pass it on to Rio to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Tobi. And I also want to thank Samala, Caleb, Nick, and the rest of the BID organizing team for putting this event together and these amazing panelists. I also give a small shout out to my friend Lafayette Cruz, who helped me think through a lot of these topics. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel on designing for Black queer pleasure, joy, and intimacy. And I want to call out a few words that we've used in this title, the first being design. And designing for something. And I want to invite guests and the panelists, which we'll do through the moderating questions, to interrogate what that means and its implications. The second word I want to hone in is queer. Some of you might have noticed that we added it in to the digital ads. And I think it may call out a potential elephant in the room, which is this notion of identity politics or hyper-identity politics, why we thought it was important to call out queer, and define this as a topic around Black queer pleasure, joy, and intimacy. But before we dive into that, I have the great honor of introducing this truly incredible panel of people. The first who will be presenting after I give quite a range of introductions will be Ashon Crawley. Ashon Crawley is an associate professor of religious studies and African American and African studies at the University of Virginia. He's the author of Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, an investigation of aesthetics and performance as modes of collective social imagination, as well as The Lonely Letters, an exploration of the interrelations of Blackness, mysticism, quantum mechanics, and love. He's currently working on a third book, congrats, tentatively titled Made Instrument, about the role of the Hammond organ and the institutional and historic Black church, a Black sacred practice, and in Black social life more broadly. All his work is about otherwise possibility. We also have with us Leslie Wilson and Aneesah Ettress. Leslie Wilson is Assistant Professor of Art History and Museum Studies Program Liaison for Art History at Purchase College, State University of New York. Dr. Wilson's teaching and research focuses on the global history of photography, modern and contemporary art from Africa and the African diaspora, American art post-1900s, and museum studies. Her current project charts the development and popularization of color photography in South Africa, from its inception in the early 20th century to contemporary practices. She has held curatorial internships at the Art Institute of Chicago, Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, and the St. Louis Art Museum. From 2015 to 2017, she was the 24-month Chester Dale Pre-Doctoral Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Aneesah Ettress is an arts professional and writer based in the Denver metro area. Moved by the intersections of art and religion, she seeks to center historically underrepresented narratives in the work of POC artists past and present. She recently completed the Masters of Divinity program at the University of Chicago, also congrats, with a research interest in the prophetic imagination of contemporary Black artists. Though through her curatorial practice, she hopes to communicate that art is at work to transform the soul. And last on our panel is Adam R. Adam R. is an audio and video technologist, DJ, and one of the co-founders of Poppy Juice, a Brooklyn-based art collective that aims to affirm and celebrate the lives of queer and trans people of color. Adam's music and digital art are inspired by his Caribbean and African-American heritage. His work reflects his interest in Afrofuturism, Afro-pessimism, and the diaspora at large. And we will begin with some presentations, and so I will hand it over to Ashon.
Hi, everyone. It is really a joy to be on a panel about joy and pleasure with regards to Black queerness and design. And so I'm very happy to be joining you. Thank you for the invitation, Samala, and for everyone that is here today. I figured the best way for me to do this, can I have my slides, please? I think I'm supposed to say. I felt like the best way to do this was to walk you very quickly through some of the ideas that I've been trying to work on. When I was an undergraduate student at University of Pennsylvania, I took 2 architecture courses. And in those courses, we learned about section drawing, and it was my favorite part of that course. Couldn't take any more architecture courses because it costs a lot of money to buy paper and ink and pens and Mylar. And so I'd taken off for a very long time. In 2018, I'd gone to Italy, and I went to the Maxi Museum, which is their contemporary art museum in Rome. And there was an exhibit about Italian architecture from 1950 to the contemporary moment. And there was a lot of section drawings. And the section drawings reminded me, one, of the section drawings I used to do when I was in my architecture courses in undergrad. But they also prompted in me a desire to really think about what do section drawings actually reveal in terms of things that are hidden, because I'm also thinking in the register of spirituality. So I'm always thinking about what do surfaces hold, but also what's sort of hidden within those surfaces. And I think of queerness as a practice of revealing a kind of hiddenness that is sort of germane to us all. And some of us actually allow for the flourishing of that hiddenness. And so I've been really trying to think with section drawings as a concept, as a method, as a mode for thinking about various practices, including painting, including song making, and some of my writing too. I'm trying to. It's not advancing to the next slide. I don't know how to. Okay. And so some of the paintings that I've been doing are based on Pentecostal church experiences where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of exuberance. And so I take paint, I put it on my hands, and I listen to praise breaks of people that are worshiping quickly or worshiping intensely, often to fast-paced music called shouting music. I take paint and I put it on my hands and I listen to the music and I clap to the rhythm of what I'm hearing from a YouTube church service. And so this is one of the paintings that I did where I had paint on my hands and I'm clapping over the surface of paper. I also have this clear sort of, paint that's also in my hands, and I'm letting it spread and I'm letting it splatter because I wanted to see what does paint do when it meets the surface, if it is based on the sort of propulsiveness and the intensity of Pentecostal praise. I think that, Pentecostalism taught me a lot of things. One of the things it taught me was joy. Another thing it taught me was to be ashamed of queerness. And so trying to think about how does this one place contain this complexity towards joy, but also this way that it tries to shame us for desire. And is there a way to critique the shame for desire by thinking about the joy? And so trying to take a painting and thinking about, or trying to take these practices and to repurpose them, to think with them in the service of producing a critique of like homophobia, transphobia. And so I'm doing these paintings where I have paint on my hands and I'm letting it splatter. Okay, and so I decided to, after seeing the the exhibit at the Maxi Museum in Rome, I decided to try to apply a section drawing methodology to sort of two-dimensional flat surface paintings. And so I said, what would happen if I imagined the red has a certain depth, if the blue has a certain depth, if the purple has a certain depth, and if the turquoise has a certain depth. And it's based on my imaginative process. These aren't real things, but they are imagined. And so this is one side of that section. Oops, sorry, go back. This is another side of that section. But I'm also interested in sort of augmented reality and hologram technology, but holograms don't exist in the way that I need them to exist. And so I started using different design programs, first in my iPad that I was Googling, just things that I was finding, trying to think about how to sort of render this two-dimensional surface within 3 dimensions, with the hopes of trying to translate the praise noise that produces the painting into something that you can inhabit through augmented reality. And so these are just the pictures of what that looked like once I put these in these digital programs. Trying to move quickly because of time. And so then there's this Maya application, which I found, I didn't know about it. And I'm taking that first image of that first painting and I'm rendering it through these 3-dimensional programs. And so I got access to, in 2019, it was a beta program at the time, Adobe's Project Aero. And Adobe's Project Aero, which is now available for everyone, but it was a beta program at the time. And so it's an augmented reality program. And so I took the 3-dimensional image that I was able to render through Maya and I imported it into Project Aero. And so I want to play that. Hopefully it'll play. So this is what the model looks like as a 3-dimensional augmented reality model, but it's pretty small. I'm looking at the floor through Project Aero. And if you look at the first image that I post on my Instagram, you'll see that it's from the painting that I created last year based on hand clapping, listening to Pentecostal music. This is supposed to be a sort of representation of that 3-dimensionally. But what I can do with this is blow it up to make it even bigger so I can theoretically walk through this scene. So let me do that. Now this is the same image, the same model, but blown up to be a much bigger scale. I want to say it's kind of like a life scale, but it's not really that. But you can see that I'm walking through it virtually. I'm walking through the red and the blue. I'm walking through it as if I were in it, which is kind of amazing. And as I look up, I can see the white structures, the blue, the turquoise structures. You can see the various structures that are around me as I actually look around through Project Aero. And the point of it was to see what would happen if we spatialize the praise noise of Pentecostalism as if you can inhabit it. Because the praise noise of Pentecostalism, when you are in a church service, for example, is something that you inhabit, but it is I don't want to say it's purely sonic, but it is a sonic sort of manifestation of vibration. And so I'm trying to think about the visual register of that sonic vibration by thinking through the sort of technological apparatus of what are these considered these section drawings. Can we skip the third of these videos and move to the first video of the person? Yeah, can we show this video, please? But just 30 seconds of it before you press play. And so I'm trying to take that same idea of thinking about what is hidden, what is sort of beneath the surface of a thing, in order to explore practices of joy through this. That's enough of that one. And so this is a song by Steve Reich, who's a very well-known musician. And this is a very well-known song, which is called Music for 18 Musicians, which was first recorded in 1976. It's a song that's in 55 minutes that has 11 chords, and each movement moves through the 11 chord cycle. And so it's deeply repetitious, it's deeply meditative, but it's also really, in its repetition, it's really regular. And so I wanted to think about, is there something hidden beneath the surface, the sonic surface of this thing? And so I, taking my Pentecostal background, put the sound of a Hammond organ and the sound of a choir singing the words "Yes" and "Yes, Lord" to Music for 18 Musicians, and the project is called Yes, Lord. And so, Nick, can you skip the next video and play the one after that? It should say "To Be" with like people on the screen. And so the point, and we're singing the word yes and the word yes, Lord, because one of the things that queerness has taught me against the doctrines and theologies of the church, which I think of as very peculiar surfaces, is that Pentecostalism has taught me what it means to actually say yes to Black queerness, which is to say yes to a joyful disposition, to say yes to an imaginative disposition against the normative world. And so trying to think with music that already exists, trying to think with art practices that already exist, to explore what is beneath, what is hidden, what is in the interior, in order to make those things that are in the interior apparent so that they can be cultivated and celebrated, is something that queerness has taught me how to do. And so trying to think with that as a practice of art making is something that I am trying to do. And so I'm just very glad that I can share a little bit of that work and be in conversation with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashon. Next, we'll hear from Leslie and Aneesah.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. I am delighted to be in conversation with this panel. Ashon, thank you for blowing our minds from the beginning, and to be presenting alongside Aneesah, Ettress. I'll be providing some background on the mechanics and premise of the exhibition we worked on together ahead of talking more directly about its connections to the themes of Black joy, pleasure, and intimacy and queerness that brings us here together today, and which Aneesah will address more directly in her section of the talk. Nick, can we see the slides, please? So during my time as the curatorial fellow for diversity in the arts at the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago, I was asked to teach a course in UChicago's Department of Art History that offered students the opportunity to collaboratively curate an exhibition at the museum, which I did in coordination with Barrett Ness, the Smart Museum's Assistant Curator of Academic Engagement. For a range of practical and structural reasons, I taught the course in 2 parts, with its first part convening in spring of 2019 and its second in fall of 2019. At the warp speed of UChicago's quarter system, Spring 2019's Exhibition and Practice course brought 13 students ranging from undergraduate to PhD together to conceptualize, plan, and design an exhibition in 10 weeks that would open that October, overseen by an entirely new group, save from Aneesah, of 13 students. 2 undergraduate researchers joined the project over the summer. By the time we wrapped, a total of 26 students had contributed to the project. For the record, this is an entirely wild way to build an exhibition, especially one that was comprised of half permanent collection works and half loans. And here you see examples of the exhibition's graphic identity designed by the wonderful Chicago-based artist Brandon Breaux, and I'd be happy to talk about that further. Some of you may know Brandon's work from like many other projects, but including designing Chance the Rapper's mixtape album covers. In light of a recent series of exhibitions at the Smart Museum, including The Time Is Now, Art Worlds of Chicago's South Side, 1960 to 1980, and Solidary and Solitary, among others, that had prominently featured work by artists of African descent at the Smart Museum, I communicated to students that we weren't doing a show of institutional firsts or of gap filling. The show that we could build might feel altogether more like a B-side, offering a tighter conceptual focus, which in its own right was a kind of gift, taking the pressure off of the heavy lifting so often demanded of work shown ostensibly in the name of representation. The challenge I set for students was what would be the merits of a show at the Smart Museum in the year 2019 that used, even in small part, identity as an aspect of its organizational logic. Should we? If we did, what kinds of stories could we tell? I'm just showing a few examples of installation views. I broke the curatorial cohort into 4 groups that needed to create an exhibition proposal at midterm, thinking with and beyond our collection. We could either run in the direction of one of the proposed shows or craft a show that drew from a combination of those proposals. Within that, we also needed to develop trust and awareness within our diverse group, to have challenging conversations about identity, to hold space for awkward silences, of which there were many, to be challenged by what the artwork offered, to try not to strong-arm artwork to fit a curatorial premise, to let the art show us what it needed. In the end, Downtime on the Art of Retreat was an amalgam, drawing from proposals that included an examination of photography at the intersection of race and privacy. And Ashon, I couldn't help but think about the fact that hiddenness and evasion from view was something that was a key theme for us. The many dimensions of Afrofuturism was another theme, materials of grief and mourning, and exploring Black art in many registers, from literal to metaphorical. One group that had proposed a plan to actually put the word Black into the Smart Museum's database and just use everything that came up with that search term in the database to kind of bring some other version of Blackness to the fore. Downtime explored retreat as the idea of taking time and space away from everyday life and extreme events. Indeed, amongst the 26 students who worked on the project, retreat was the one word we felt we could agree on. It was a generous framework that engaged interests in documentary photography, speculative history, craft, and much more. It also offered a framework that appealed to the students and the course for its universality. We all need time and space away, but it has particular charge and significance when we consider downtime in relation to Black lives, when the we breaks down, We reflected on the hard-fought-for access to sites of leisure, that Chicago's deadliest race riots started at the unofficially segregated beach in 1919, as we asked ourselves about who can just stand on a corner and be presumed to be resting or waiting or loitering, as we wondered about how a nighttime stroll to look at the stars could be greeted with suspicion, and many other variations on these scenarios. Downtime was then both title and concept. It held together the richness of the ideas that the cohort was creating and meaningfully engaged the provocations of artworks by the likes of Severa Simmons, Carrie Mae Weems, Meg Smith, Stanley Wolakau Wanambwa, Jatavia Gary, and others in that show. Downtime is a demand. It signifies, as Henry Louis Gates Jr. might say, it speaks to key themes of rest and recovery while invoking Down's use in Black vernacular to mean cool and to assert affinity. It points to how time itself has been and can be racialized. It attends to a claim for Black people to take time and space, to take up time and space on their own terms. Even more than that, downtime could even be anti-time, against time, down with time. And yet the curatorial cohort weren't initially all sold on this title, even though I campaigned hard. I said that this title is an argument for something like Black time, or maybe Black time off. Can there be such a thing? The show had been moving towards a question of whether the definition of retreat that it had proposed was in fact possible. Can one escape racial violence? How? For how long? Where to? To Martha's Vineyard, to Martha's Vineyard, as with the work of Lois Mailou Jones, and you see her watercolor on the far right here of this installation view, and she used to summer in Martha's Vineyard, which was home to a kind of Black vacation community far earlier than in many other sites in the United States. To Paris, like James Baldwin, in the Silver Point drawing by Mario Moore, we gave this very small work, the whole wall, as you can see here. And Baldwin indeed is like the 21st century's Mark Twain, quoted ad nauseum. There was a way in which giving him space on this wall was also a gesture to give him rest, to give James Baldwin a break. To the south of France, like Faith Ringgold, and the confection of her central protagonist, William Marie Simone, you can see more closely here, in her French collection series of painted quilts. Or to West Africa and fields of pattern, like Gerald Williams in this cut paper paint and ink work that you see here. Or to the space of queer parties in Chicago, as with the work of Patrick McCoy that you see in these photographs. Indeed, was downtime a space of could it be the space of the exhibition itself? Was it an action? Was it a process? And here I turn it over to Aneesah Ettress to help us think about these questions further.
Thank you, Leslie. So when Leslie invited me to think about downtime, I really wanted to wrestle with the context of the programs and why we as students, student co-curators, made the decisions we did in relation to the exhibition. So for a bit, I will touch on what I wanted to do with the downtime public programs, and then I will describe them in more detail. But I would like to say that we were collaborators in bringing these programs forward. There was a small group of around 4 students, of which I was a part, who brought forth these ideas. So coming from the MDiv program at UChicago, I was thinking about the possibilities of curatorial practice as a form of ministry, and considering the museum and programming the museum as a place where ministering can occur for folks who may desire it or need it. And this is what I was attempting to do with downtime, aside from the central themes of the exhibition. So within the context of the show, I really wanted us to first practice and live out the concepts, moods, and thematics of the exhibition in real time. And some of those, of course, were retreat, rest, party, play, and escape. And second, I was interested in the museum becoming a sanctuary. And by this, I mean both a sacred place that is set apart, but also a place of relative safety for those who are at the margins of society and have been estranged from religious community, especially Black queer folks. So in order to practice downtime, my colleagues and I drew inspiration from the artwork of Mario Moore that you just saw with James Baldwin at rest in the windowsill, and then the photographs taken by Patrick McCoy of the Rialto Tap, and the story he told of this bar where there were different waves of people partying. We used those artworks as our guiding force to create the programs and ultimately misuse the space of the museum in very purposeful ways. So our first program that you'll see at the top left, that's kind of blue, that was a silent disco and performance night that we held with UChicago students. And here we were able to experiment with this concept of the party coming in waves and creating a place of celebration and self-expression. And Leslie and I reflected on the fact that we didn't really know as participants what would be evolving and happening next. So with the headphones on, we occupied this world together while simultaneously preserving the almost essential and quintessential quiet and silence of the museum space, which was super interesting. And the way the night unfolded with no clear start and end time to particular activities felt like practicing and living CPT. The second program, also pictured here at the bottom right with the altar and sort of the darkened photograph, that happened in the galleries of Downtime, and it was a nap experience facilitated by Reverend Tricia Hersey of the Nap Ministry. So after a small group of around 10 of us finished a guided napping session together, we had a conversation with Tricia about the importance of rest and how it is a part of her artistic practice and her praxis of Black liberation. So in these interventions, we attempted to practice downtime, and in so doing made retreat a possibility, but not a guarantee. Through this, we opened up time for Black people and centered Black ways of knowing, embodying, and occupying space, even though those who participated in these programs and saw the exhibition, it was a very diverse and wide audience. Months later, after Downtime closed, I learned that there is a Black community member who for years made a pilgrimage to the Smart Museum lobby several times a week. And when I would come in for my internship, I remember seeing him, and he would sit in the lobby and draw or write or do whatever he pleased. I wasn't paying super close attention to what he was doing. But I think he continued to come back because being in the lobby space and creating in that space brought him some semblance of joy and comfort, even if that expression of joy wasn't legible to us through being loud, boisterous, or even particularly friendly or inviting. The conditions that made this possible for this community member, it wasn't a program or even an explicit invitation, but simply the availability of a quiet indoor place to sit and little to no disruption or questioning. So to wrap up quickly, it seems the troublesome nature of Downtime, the exhibition, continues on. That is to say, it is both in the active cultivating of space and in the absence of intervention that can create a retreat and time away from the everyday. It is both active and inactive, and I think that is truly wonderful. And I guess we'll pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie and Aneesah. And last, we'll hear from Adam R.
Hi, Rio. Thank you and Samala for having me and for the rest of the team on the conference. My name is Adam Rhodes, and I am one of the co-founders of Poppy Juice, along with Oscar Nunez and Mohammed Fayez. We started, I'm going to talk a little bit about just like our the foundation of Poppy and kind of trace an arc from the macro to like addressing a large community to the micro of community members enjoying spaces for intimacy and joy. So I can start my slides, yeah. Yes, so hold on, I'm trying to get this remote. Oh, okay, got it. Poppy Juice is an art collective that aims to affirm and celebrate the lives of queer and trans people of color. Structured around our curated events, Poppy lives in the intersection of art, music, and nightlife. As you can see here, this is the three of us, myself, Oscar at the top, and Mohammed down there at the bottom. We met, Oscar and I met in 2013 via Tumblr, and we had friends in common in IRL, so we decided to start hanging out and just became regular friends. We live in the same neighborhood, and the ball just got rolling from there. We were both DJs at the time, doing like parties in undergrad, house parties, dorm parties, what have you, and that kind of allowed us to figure out each other's sound, and we were aware of each other in that way sonically for a while. So I'm just gonna go on to the next. Goodness, Oscar and I went to our friend at a local bar in Bed-Stuy. A bar was called One Last Shag, and he was a manager, our friend Pepper. And Pepper gave us the opportunity 2 weeks before Pride in 2013 to have an event. Oscar and I decided, okay, we're gonna do this. And so we had to rush to create a flyer. The very first one, as you can see in the top left over here. Woof. And we just circulated it on social media, Facebook for the most part, and verbally with friends. And we were surprised that people came out for Pride Weekend in 2013 to a small divey bar with a backyard in Brooklyn. And from there, we were invited to come back for a monthly. And 2 or 3 parties in, we brought Mohammed Fayez on to start doing flyers. And you can see our design language changed, thankfully. It's moved from a little bit of an internet aesthetic, found internet pictures to actually professionally illustrated flyers, which Mohammed does beautifully here. So yeah, those, again, we circulated on social media, and we talked with friends. It was word of mouth for a very long time until we got developed sort of a following, which didn't happen overnight at all. So yeah, next slide. Fast forward to 3 years ago, when we venue hopped a couple of times between One Last Shag in Bed-Stuy to now elsewhere in Bushwick, where we can host up to, we can see up to 2,000 to plus people a night on one of our regular semi-monthly parties. These are some pictures of those. We decorate the space, we change the space, try to make it unique for all of our events, give people a sense that they're in a special circumstance that isn't just a regular blank walled venue. We use lights and plants and other sorts of things, projections in the space. Yeah, and just kind of moving from like that large scale of modifying the space to smaller groups of people. Again, you can see like people enjoying themselves, having a great time here. And some of the stuff on the walls and the lights are visible. But yeah, we really focus on bringing together Black and Brown people in this really beautiful space of revelry, and do everything that we can. We curate our musicians and our photographers and our lighting designers and our set designers. All of them are, some people are rotating, some people are different every time in terms of the people that we work with. So yeah, there's some other photos of the venue there. And then you have these spaces that are in the venue that are built in that allow for these really beautiful moments of people gathering. I just want to call attention to the fact that we don't always have this space as Black and brown queer people, specifically queer people, and not just like cis gay men or cis women, but queer people as an overarching umbrella term, Black queer people and Black and brown queer people. So I just wanted to call to attention with that with some of these photos here. And again, we have, again, focusing even further down to individual community members. Some friends of ours, we work with a collective sometimes called Bubble Tea. We worked with them, collaborated with them in the past. And so on the left, you have two members of that collective. On the right, you have some other friends of ours who come to the party sometimes as well. And yeah, here we have some more intimate moments. Again, I'm thinking about one thing that we think about in our venue choice and in our just design choices in general is how to make spaces safer for all of our community members. We talk with venue security and management and make sure that everyone's comfortable. For example, like making sure people can get in okay, especially with people who may have a name or that's different or a picture that's different than is on their ID. We really make sure that people are able to get in and have a good time. Also, we have community notes that I don't have here, but we use those to kind of give people a preface of what is entailed in the space and how they can keep each other safe and the space enjoyable. Again, here we have some beautiful people from the nights of these past years. Yeah, I just wanted to include that in there as well. One thing that is really important to harken back to Leslie and Aneesah's work is the spaces for rest and intimacy. I'm thinking about here on the right, these young people braiding hair or just playing with hair on the stairs. In the upper left, just kind of moments of chilling, hanging out, taking a break from music, taking a break from the dance floor. And lower left, you just have some friends of ours doing their thing, showing up in whatever they feel comfortable showing up in, showing up as their full selves comfortably, and not having to worry about anything. Getting home, getting there, all of it should be seamless. As much as we can, we do as much as we can to make the experience seamless for everyone and enjoyable. And yeah, that is the gist of Poppy Juice. I'll hand it back.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, Ashon, Leslie, Aneesah, for these fabulous presentations with a lot of just richness that I think we could dive into. I do want to start maybe with where we find ourselves, at least digitally, which is the Harvard GSD, a school dedicated to training people around design and specifically architecture. Ashon, you've talked about both in your presentation, but also in an article you wrote for NPR on Little Richard, the kind of creative capacities of the section. But in your presentation, you also talked about when taking an architectural course became too costly or that there was a barrier to this tool of imagination. And I think what we've seen in Leslie, Aneesah, and Adam's presentation, as well as Ashon's presentation, is this question around an ethic, a methodology of visualizing and fostering something that may be elusive or hidden or evasive. So I want to start off with just some thoughts on what are the potential values or violences of schools of architecture, urban planning, and design attempting to map, understand, or even design for and potentially formalize something that we could call Black queer space, Black queer joy, intimacy, and pleasure.
I mean, I'd just say really quickly that I think that what schools should do with resources is make those resources available to the people who are living the affective and emotional lives, as opposed to trying to colonize the affective and emotional practice of sociality and make it proper to itself as an institution. What would happen if instead of like, oh, we should bring that here and house it here and like try to own it here? What would happen if instead of that, there's a different kind of relation to a real thinking with, a living with, a sitting with, such that it's not about making everything apparent or evident or seen. I think it would require an epistemological shift in how universities actually think about what knowledge is and how it's produced and what it means to be a person who is marginalized within this sort of matrix. That would be required, I think, before it could actually, with integrity, attempt to, think through those practices in ways that would be generative, as opposed to just another way that universities then sort of practice of colonization. But that's me.
I mean, I'll chime in and kind of in relation to that. There's this issue around naming things, right? I was the curatorial fellow for diversity in the arts, was my title. And I, spoke very directly kind of after coming in with this in mind, that it was the kind of title that is there for the administration. It's there for the institution, right? To see a certain kind of thing being done within it, right? Or a certain thing being performed, to track it and assert that is happening. And I always felt deeply suspicious about it. So sometimes people would ask me about it and I would give them what I thought of as the very UChicago answer, that I saw my job as asking what diversity meant in and of itself. Right? That it wasn't something that was settled, but that was always the question, right? And I think that idea that we can activate or spin it around and make these attempts to concretize or kind of show the visibility, to try to make that a problem in and of itself. It is additional work, but it feels like it's a way to try to hold the discomfort that I think that's already being produced within the institution.
Adam, I know that in organizing meeting, you've talked about the kind of counter side, though, around a lack of formalization, and that Poppy Juice has itself encountered its own fair share of hostility because it relies on venues and the real estate market, and because that ephemerality, which many people are attracted to, is itself vulnerable when it is not formalized within these regimes. I'm wondering if you could kind of share a little bit more about the difficulties around something like Poppy Juice, which is unique because of its ephemerality, but also has to really combat with a kind of mythology, a celebrity, and as you've mentioned, doesn't always have or the ability to highlight, I think, queer and brown trans people as it becomes popular. And for those who don't know, Poppy Juice is like the shiz, right? So everyone really does love that event.
Thank you. Just to your last point, we work super hard actually to try and hire as many queer and brown trans folks as we can, not just as a tokenization thing, but as some of our best friends and most talented artists are Black and trans DJs. But that's just to the last note. On the ephemerality piece, one thing I think that is great about the ephemerality is that we are not tied to any one place. Like, we do have a residency at Elsewhere in Bushwick, Brooklyn, that we've had for the past 3.5 or so years. But we also have had Poppy in Toronto. We've had it in New Orleans. We've had it in Miami. We are about to have an event in Europe in a week. So that the ephemerality and meaning that we're not tied to any one place allows us to move pretty freely. The tension, though, between I think the name of Poppy and the notoriety of the name, and that notoriety actually is limiting in a sense that it keeps us from doing more, I would say, underground parties, or maybe some of you or some of the audience members have been to warehouse parties or raves or things that are a little bit are even further on the spectrum of ephemerality in terms of their like appearing and reappearing and disappearing and reappearing in random spots. And I think that we are a little limited in terms of our ability to hold those types of events, which I love. I love a warehouse rave or a pop-up party or a pop-up event. And that is that's a hard thing to contend with at times, because I have colleagues and friends who work in that mode specifically, and who we brought on as rotating DJs at different times, but to have a Poppy event that has that level of kind of a ability to pop up, ability to kind of be in one place and another is hard, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's... I want to maybe return to then, Leslie, you brought up this like need to name. And I'm thinking, Ashon, in your NPR article about Little Richard, there's a point where you start talking about the speaking in tongues, right? A kind of naming of something that would be incommensurable. And I'm going to get to this question of commensurability or legibility and understanding. And Leslie and Aneesah, you talked about in your exhibit Downtime that it wasn't so much the exhibition in this pre-meeting of certain events, but kind of finding a methodology that you could work with. Leslie, I believe you talked about Harriet Jacobs's loophole of retreat and how Harriet Jacobs, the enslaved woman who we know of her work through her writing, was able to create that loophole of retreat through a gimlet, a kind of hand tool for drilling small holes in wood that she uses to cut through to see and puncture the veil between herself and exterior world. Ashon, as I mentioned before, you write about the architectural section and its capacity for imagination. Beyond potentially the section, I'm wondering if all of you could maybe talk a little bit about what are some gimlets that you've either made that isn't formalized within architectural or urban discourse and tool making, or even comes from the fields of architecture and urban planning.
Sure. So I will give a little bit of background on the gimlet, just because I think also the experience around coming to that feels like it's also part of like this method, which is that I was having a conversation in a West Loop coffee shop, and the kind of meandering, kind of like long conversation with my dear friend Mlandi Zondi, who is now on faculty at USC. And I was saying, well, there's work in the show, such as Jatavia's video, which, cuts in between scenes of Jatavia in the gardens at Giverny, moments from the fatal traffic stop with Philando Castile, but we're not seeing Philando, we're seeing Philando's partner Diamond kind of responding and experiencing grief in real time in the video. It's a really challenging video to watch. And my students were asking questions about, is the space of the exhibition a retreat? If we show this, what will it do in the space of the show? How do we design for this? And we ended up building a black box for this work. But I was telling Mlandi, I was like, I'm really concerned, about how people will experience this work. My students are expressing concern. One of the only Black students in the class had actually come to me offline to talk to me about this work, to say they were worried. And I said, Mlandi, what do you think about this? And Mlandi was the one who brought up Harriet Jacobs and said, well, I think if your show is doing something right, it's exploring the gimlet. It's exploring the devices that can be used to cut a hole, to make a space for oneself, even in the most extreme circumstances. What are the openings that we're able to make for ourselves? And sometimes that opening is a hiding. Sometimes it is in a space where one cannot be seen. And it was, I felt like I melted into my chair when Mlandi said, I was just like, yes, it's the gimlet, the show is the gimlet. I went back to my students and I was like, it's the gimlet, y'all. Like, this is, so, and it felt like it opened something wide up. It was, we looked back at Roy de Carava and in a hallway, we looked at darkness. We started to look, Carrie Mae Weems, if she puts us in the threshold space, of an opening between lovers, right? Work that put us, Derek Woods Morrow is also somebody who's really interested in darkness and that using black and white and kind of pushing it as dark as it can go in this way that, even Kerry James Marshall in his painting is pushing darkness as far as it can go. And so we started to elicit things that were not necessarily about seeing someone enjoying themselves. It could be about looking at a space that might be able to accommodate furtiveness, right? That could accommodate an encounter. Where does one cruise? And so that became a really important entry point for looking for work to do different things for us. And I think looking for programming. And I think Aneesah's exploration of curatorial work and its intersections with ministry was also significant in this way.
I'll just jump off of that a little bit and say, in thinking about the show itself being a gimlet, I think just that approach transformed because the exhibition was in the back gallery of the museum. So the exhibition was physically sort of hidden and kind of pushed into a corner, so to speak, of the actual museum space. And because of that, just as an intern walking through the galleries on a daily basis, I was able to have confessional-like conversations with Black folks that would enter the space, enter the exhibition, and really intimate moments were able to happen. And so, again, I think the show just kind of replicated its assertions and arguments, and it was really fruitful. I think it did the thing, so to speak.
To go off of the gimlet idea, also, I think one of the gimlets. I think Poppy Juice is largely a gimlet to like what Black queer space can be, and could be in the future. Could be for all of us. Like just a way to imagine what an ideal, not that Poppy Juice is always the ideal. That would be saying too much of myself, or too much of ourselves. But just an idea of what how we can enjoy ourselves in a space that's ours. That we claim as ours, if even for a night. And we change the space again with like a rotating lineup of like musicians and lighting designers and set designers, and those are all the tools that we use to move to what things can look like, possibly.
I'll just, I think for me, one of the things that I use to produce opening or rupture or disruption is questions. I think of questions as critical tools, like trying to figure out what are the right questions to be asking, that can get us toward a different sense for what questions can be, and then also for the possibility for a response. In a very simple way, like, it's very rare for me at this point to ask people about their identity, and much more being interested in, what are your commitments? What are your commitments to sort of anti-racist struggle? What are your commitments to trans life? What is your commitment to the flourishing of people who are marginalized by the normative world? Because I think in that we might get something closer to a kind of opening, or I think it can open up space for us to really, one, reimagine who it is that we think that we are, the ones who are asking the questions, but then also it can help us in conversation and in social space for the folks who are hearing the questions to also perhaps begin to reimagine who they might be as well. So questions for me allow me to think with various kinds of media. So trying to produce questions are really important to me.
I've been making my way through Sadia Hartman's Scene of Subjection, which is a really dense book. I'm not gonna go over it, but I'm thinking of when she writes about the coffle, the slave coffle in the market. And I'm trying to go back to part of that question around equivalence and legibility. And Hartman writes the slave coffle as extremely a point of terror and sadness of ripping a family away, but the ways in which they were asked to perform joyfulness, so that at the slave market, people would see them as a kind of positive product to be exchanged. And to be clear, I'm not making an equivalence between the work we're doing and what Sadia Hartman's history is going over, but this idea of when joy needs to be registered as joy, and maybe not something like downtime. And so Leslie and Aneesah, I'm thinking of the ways in which, Black queer joy and intimacy could very much be refusal, or non-visual, It's different than potentially, I think, the party, which we might recognize immediately as a form of joy. And maybe we could think a little bit through this question around why we wanted to insert queerness into the title, especially on a topic of naming, Why it's Black queer joy, Black queer pleasure, and Black queer intimacy. And if these adjectives or actions are commensurable or even equivalent to the more kind of everyday universal definitions of joy, which is that positive, warm, feeling, fuzzy of moods, or if, I believe, Ashon, you were the one who said queer space as the practice of revealing hiddenness, could reveal something about some of the limits of normative notions of joy. That joy isn't always the smile and the party. I admit that's a little of a loaded question, but thoughts.
I mean, that's I don't know, that's church for me. We would sing songs. If you can't tell, but I grew up Pentecostal. I was a preacher and a choir director and a musician. Played the Hammond organ for 16 years, consistently for churches. I was real committed to it. And then I became a student chaplain for Metro State Prison for Women, and it was all right, I'm good, because what we are being asked to do seems really vulgar within the context of the world where we're just asked to preach sermons. So I was really sort of steeped in the world. One of the things that we sang often was about having joy in sorrow. That joy is not about happiness. Joy is joy ends up being this disposition that allows you a certain kind of latitude and energy to actually struggle through happiness and sorrow. That joy is a resource, joy, and it's a resource that is mostly had in community with others. That it doesn't mark happiness as much as it marks capacity, capacity to breathe, capacity to live, capacity to get through. And so, I think that the joy of queerness for me is about fully renouncing any kind of anxiety about not being normal, because the way the concept of the normal is produced is by relinquishing relation to the various ways we can be in relation. And so for me, it's always a directional problem. That for me, queerness is the thing that exists, not as identity, but as the capacity for an imaginative being in relation with one another. And that what folks who live under the sign and heading or perhaps identity of queerness do is that we accept the disposition of living life as uncertain and thus can also be joyful, because relation can also be uncertain and it can go in many directions, but it has to be consensual at its ground and root, and it has to be about friendship at its ground and root. And so like for me, like that is actually available to all of us, but that there is this relinquishing of this capacity, which is deeply imaginative, and we relinquish it so that we can be constituted in the thing called normal. And so putting, you know, I feel like it's less about putting or inserting queer into the title as opposed to discovering the various ways queerness was always the title, precisely because joy is something that also don't make no sense according to a kind of logic of like, joy is good, and if things are bad, I couldn't have it. It's like, you know, I don't, you know. And last thing I'll say is Frederick Douglass, who, you know, Saidiya Hartman talks about in Sing Subjection. Frederick Douglass talks about enslaved people singing to the great house and like how they can sing a rapturous sentiment with a pathetic tone and a pathetic sentiment with a rapturous tone. He's trying to say like what you think what you should expect based on the sound doesn't have to match up with the lyrical content, and what you might expect with the lyrical content doesn't, that these things can go in multiple directions. And so you have to be attentive to the context under which something is being rehearsed, practiced, enunciated. And I think that too is a kind of call toward relinquishing this desire for kind of linear trajectories for knowledge, linear trajectories for understanding. And so, yeah, like, joy and, joy being silent sometimes and it being secretive and hidden sometimes, that makes perfect sense to me because I think that, and for those of us who have practiced queerness intentionally, a lot of the joys that we have had to have been silent because we couldn't name the other person, or the other person wouldn't name or claim us or the people. And so like, what does one do? It doesn't mean the joy isn't real. It actually just means that the joy that was so real and felt and life altering is also something that, you can't speak about. And so what does one do with that is like, for me, the thing that I'm constantly trying to wrestle with.
Ashon, this makes me think about a conversation I've been having with friends about the queerness of the sad banger, right? I made a sad bangers playlist, right? It's not right, but it's okay, right? It's just but some sense that we're at the intersection of something that doesn't, when you break it down, you shouldn't be dancing, right? And yet somehow that is the energy.
That's a great song. I mean, it's a great song,
right?
It's such a good song.
And so it's, I think that that when you talk about it, it is a sensibilities is kind of what I find myself thinking about. And the fact that Aneesah made many, wonderful contributions to the exhibition, and getting the chance to think in community about the exhibition was so exciting. But one of those contributions was to create these cards that said, my downtime sounds like, my downtime smells like, my downtime looks like. And we just collected these, and we collected them in albums. And the way where people went with these was radically diverse, right? It was from Sade to croissants to naps to, people went a lot of places, but I think also to quiet or silence or the doing nothing, right? Or some sense of what that looks like. And I think that can entertain refusal. But also because we were thinking in community, some of what the students suggested for works in the show, it was, in some cases it was the deep cuts from certain artists where, they were like, well, Ming Smith traveled to Japan. Her ex-husband was a jazz musician. And so we could just look at, what was she looking at in Japan, and that idea of the fact of Black travel for pleasure. Right? That we weren't going to, this, famous photographer from the Kamoinge workshop to look at Harlem, which, or to look at Black experience as such through the photograph, to look at her looking, to look with someone else. Also felt like, what does it mean to be put in that space to look with? Or to look at certain spaces such as the Rialto Tap through Patrick's photos that, the way that Patrick described it, he was like, this was not a gay bar in the sense that it was what the owners intended. It became a place that was claimed by people. And that sense too of what happens when it can't be recognized by anybody else, but you assert that this is your space. Kind of, and how, which is difficult to do, that often kind of takes us back, I think, to these questions of ephemerality. It may not be able to last, but for as long as it can last, how can we make a claim to the space?
Both Ashon and Leslie just made me think of a couple of stories having to do with Poppy. On the night of the Trayvon Martin verdict, we actually had a party scheduled, and so we did it. We went through with our night, and that was our small beginnings at One Last Shag, and it was a great space, and they had a backyard and such. But like, we all came together in community that night, like with a huge heaviness, and we played our music and gave each other hugs, but at the same time we went to the backyard to take breaks and discuss what the hell just happened, and really reflect with each other and hug each other and just be there for each other in all of our grief. So like, while it was like a joyous moment of like, yay, I'm here for Poppy, I'm seeing my friends, I might see like a couple times a week or a couple times a month or whatever, but like, I'm also like, wow, this is so messed up, and I can't believe the world we live in. And to speak to the note of like being in joy, but also being in grief at the same time, and being able to experience that together, I think was an important moment for all of us. And it happened again when the Pulse shooting happened. We had a benefit. The next week that we came together as DJs in Brooklyn, New York, to create. But in that space, we also had a wall with all the pictures of all the victims of the Pulse shooter. And that was again another moment of like, oh my God, I'm so happy to see all of your faces, my friends. But also this heaviness is huge. And figuring out how to handle that was a process. Figuring out how to be with each other and be there for each other in a way that we all needed. Lastly, I really think even during the pandemic, during lockdown, doing digital Zoom parties, and we were all separated from each other, all of us, I'm sure here as well, like for vast amounts of time. And we decided to start doing parties on Zoom to recreate some semblance of a feeling of being together. And like other collectives across the world were doing it as well. But I think that was also a moment of grief, in like being able to see your friends and new people's faces as though you're outside, or some semblance of being together. But having joy in the moment, but also being like, damn, I can't get on the train, I can't go to a bar, I can't go to a club, I can't go to a dance floor. And that's a moment of grief as well. Like, I know as a DJ, as a performer, I grieved the dance floor for a good minute, and coming back to it has been amazing. But it's that in the moment of lockdown and Zoom parties was a moment of real grief.
I think we'll open it up to some questions from the audience, but I just want to call out that a directional problem, Ashon, which you brought up, which I think shows that, as you said, Black queer space or joy is not maybe an object one designs for in studies, but is the gimlet we've been talking about that can reflect back and maybe denaturalize notions of joy or space. And I think this actually this idea really connects to Tommy's question from the audience, which is the last panel discussed and brought up the importance of hypervisibility. Here in Downtime, you were bringing up the criticality of hiddenness. Can you speak more about this? Is this hiddenness in regards to surveillance, quietude, intimacy, etc.?
I think it's a varied hiddenness. Sometimes it is a hiddenness of surveillance, or a hiddenness against surveillance, which also could be a hiddenness of quietude, which also could be a hiddenness of a certain quality of intimacy. That those don't have to be, for me, categorically distinct, but that they emerge, or the way the hiddenness is actually practiced emerges through the specific occasion. But I also think that hiddenness can be really loud, because, hiddenness can, you have to, I was watching the keynote from yesterday and talking or speaking or thinking with Catherine McKittrick. And, I think that one of the things hiddenness can also be is this thing that is happening in place in our face most of the time. But because of epistemic or epistemological convictions and also commitments to the normative world, we refuse to sense what is happening in front of us. And sometimes because we are so eye-centric, we can see things, but we don't listen well, or we don't smell well, or we don't, that whatever range of sense capacity we might have, everyone doesn't see, that we don't use the full range of our senses to actually, think about what hiddenness can actually mean. And so, hiddenness, I think, can be all of these things at the same time, that they can be escapes from surveillance in the service of producing a kind of soft and felt intimacy, and can also be used to produce something like a kind of quietude. But then, it can be a hiddenness of the loudness too.
Leslie, I'm wondering if you can talk about Stanley's photograph, because it's the one that immediately comes to mind for me in thinking about all of these different registers and ways that hiddenness exists. So maybe you can chat about it a bit, because you're really good at it.
Well, thank you, Aneesah. You can talk about it too. But I will say that so Stanley was kindly lent us a photograph that, when we were having a conversation. And again, like for me, one of the things I encouraged the students to do, I was like, we build a community around a show. I want you to talk to everybody you know. I want you to I want you to give a version of the show, to your mom, to your bus driver, to your roommates, because I think we've all seen shows where you're like, do you have a friend? Or sometimes the question is, do you have a Black friend? I don't know, whatever, insert it. But the question is and a friend, and why I say friend is because a friend tells you the truth. Okay. And so it was a thing of hear the show come back to you. Hear the ideas, what are we trying to get at here? What isn't in the show that should be? And I was doing this and talking to Stanley, and he'd sent me a photograph of a young, woman seated on a rock in a field. And I'd asked him, I was like, oh, how are you printing this? And he was like, I see it on a black wall in a black frame, with a black mat, and a deep, deep frame. And he wanted to create a sense of distance between you and the photograph. This photograph, I will say, frustrated many visitors. And I would hear it from people. They would spend a lot of time looking at it, but they were like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel about this subject. Does she want to be seen? Is she happy to be there? I feel like I can't get close to her. And I remember just feeling like this might be one of the most important works in the show. The fact that it doesn't feel like you can access the world of the subject. That even though you're seeing something figurative, and this gets to the heart of all, it can go down another rabbit hole about this relationship between figuration and abstraction in the world of Black artists. But the fact that we have something figurative that doesn't feel like it lets you in. It doesn't give you the subject, that it would seem to kind of push back on, that you see the subject and therefore you have access to some semblance of identity. And it seemed to really put up a space with that. So for me, work that can even seem to be showing you the figure, and yet you feel like you cannot get there. That sense of inner life within someone that they're able to hold on to. That is also part of this too. And that sense that by seeing you have access, no, not necessarily, right? And so I think too, to Ashon's point that, where does hiddenness live? That was something that was really exciting to tease out, again, with this group that came together around the show.
Can I just, I'm sorry, please, no.
You should go, Ashon. You should go.
Just real quick, I just wanted to say, it sounds like what that image did was actually show how hiddenness remains regardless, that there is a quality of hiddenness that will, like, even if you could touch it and you think, oh, I know this. It's like, no, you actually don't. Like, there is hiddenness in the thing that you think that you know, and there's hiddenness in the thing that makes it known that you don't know it. That hiddenness is always there, and that's something to celebrate, I think.
Just this idea of hiddenness makes me reflect, and hypervisibility and that tension makes me reflect on like how poppy juice is a space where so many people present a part of themselves that is otherwise hidden. The co-check room is often full with jackets of people to shed a skin that they wore on the subway or on the bus to reveal a beautiful outfit or some crazy look that they could not wear or cannot wear in their place. And so it's always a gift to like presentation that people bring to us. Yeah, I guess that's it.
No, that's beautiful. It makes me think of, the history of ballroom and the ways in which balls were hosted late at night so that, you did your professional work and under the guise of night, you could shed those clothings and perform this kind of spectacular performance. We have another question from the panel. And I know that we're running up a little bit on time. I also want to correct that the previous question came from Tomi. I mispronounced that name. The question that we have now from Kevin is joy resilience?
I feel a way about the term resilience or the need for it. I think I'd like to say that like joy comes from community, and community can loan itself to resilience. Like we find resilience in it, but the need for individual resilience is so sad in my opinion. Just like and so hard, honestly, to manifest. But I think. I mean, speaking from an event producer and artist's perspective, that like we as a community that we bring together for Poppy Juice, like we are resilient in that we can find a place to dance no matter what, or we'll find a venue, we'll do a beautiful event. I guess that's a form of resilience. But I think as it's popularly used, like is joy resilience? It's a little bit of a problem.
There's this performance of Nina Simone where she's at the Montreux Jazz Festival, and she's singing the song "Feelings." Whoa, 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 feelings. And she interrupts herself in the middle of singing the song, like, I can't believe this song. And then she says, I'm not mad at the man for making a song that's this sad. She says, I simply do not believe the conditions that created the situation that demanded a song like this. And so I feel that about resilience. I feel no kind of way about resilience. I think it is a thing that people use. It's a resource that people have. But for me, the thing that I'm interested in interrogating is the situation that demands resilience from it's the demand part. Like, why is I feel the same way about like forgiveness. Like it's the demand part that is the thing that is produced by this particular racialized, gendered, raced, sexed social world that we inhabit. And so like, resilience is like, for me, it's like whatever. In the same way that like, joy, so I don't collapse them in joy, but I do think that resilience is the thing that people have and use. But I'm interested in interrogating the world that has created a condition such that we, one, think of this thing surviving as resilience, but two, it demands this kind of energetic capacity for you to survive. That's the thing that I think I'm most interested in saying, like, that's the problem. Not that you have survived, but the things that you have survived are the things that we have to really, really we have to interrupt and abolish.
Yeah, I mean, I would say joy for, and not to speak for everyone, but if I can kind of speak on behalf of the class, it was impossibility, right? And it was that so much of what we were looking at dealt with the speculative. You know, we were reading Saidiya Hartman. Sarah Jane Cervenak's Wandering was another really important text for the class. Looking at Simone Lee's work and thinking about, the fact that, she's picked up the loophole of retreat as something that she's been thinking with, and how Faith Ringgold's, dealing with the speculative, that it was in kind of remaking history. These potential spaces, kind of like, what could the darkness be? But it was a lot of question marks around things. But I think that opening was really important for us. And Aneesah, I'm sure this is something you were thinking about a lot too.
Yeah, I guess I'll just quickly say in response to the question, I'm worried about tying joy to resilience. If joy is resilience, then do we have Black joy if there's not something to be resilient against? And I would say yes, of course we do. And so it reminds me also of Arthur Jaffe's work, Love is the Message is Death. I don't want to tie love and death together, or joy and resilience together. I want joy and love and all of those things to exist without Black suffering as like a precondition for their existence out of our community. And so that is what I'll say on that.
I think this is actually a great way to conclude, and maybe even say there needs to be a part 2, but this question around resilience, which honestly defines a lot of architectural practice in the climate age. And I know as a student, all I talked about was climate resilience, and I was like, this is paranoid, right? Like there is no joy in this discourse, but not to promulgate politics, but I think we're touching upon this question of naming that Leslie brought up, right? And the need to kind of know where we're going. So let's end there. This question of like resilience and maybe how it comes to an intersection with building and designing the built environment. I want to thank all of you, Adam, Aneesah, Ashon, Leslie, and the BID organizers for this panel. And if we have any final quick thoughts, just to put that out into the ether. Else, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.